such an honor for me to introduce you to Michael Nephew. You know, there are many reasons why we don't see Native American schools or a senior center or cemeteries or even a Maryland museum that interprets the lifestyles and traditions of the tribes from Ocean City to Hagerstown and to Northeast and all points in between, like a Maryland Native American museum we don't have. And I don't want to get into all the reasons why, but part of the reason is because generally, Indigenous culture and spirituality are fundamentally incompatible with capitalism. As an example, the great Paiute prophet Wovoka once said, "My young men shall never farm. Men who work the soil cannot dream, and wisdom comes to us in dreams." You ask me to dig the ground for gold and be rich like the white man. But would I cut my mother's body in her grave and fondle with her bones? So it's one thing to understand these things intellectually, but you guys are really, really in for something special because you're about to understand this from the heart when you hear Michael speak. In the words before all else, which you are about to hear, the law of the land, the great law of peace, which existed prior to colonization, is explained for everyone who gathers. And rather than pledge allegiance to a flag or predict the future or ask for forgiveness of sins, in this instance, your role and duty as a human being is explained. And so what you are about to hear are essentially instructions for life. And thus, words like these, which you would have heard every day and perhaps several times a day, are now something that only a privileged few are lucky to experience in a lifetime. Now, in tragedy, there is every opportunity to learn. And it is a great mystery why all these things have happened. But I am about to introduce to you a man who has decided, in the face of this tragedy, to live his life in a good way, one that honors those who have gone before and provides a way for those to come. Michael Nephew is a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. He is also of Seneca and Cayuga descent. He grew up in Western New York on the Cattaraugus Indian Territory and is a traditional dancer. He was president of the American Indian Society of Washington, D.C. from 1994 to 2011. And is currently the first vice president of AIS. He is also the descendant of two great chiefs, Corn Planter and Black Snake. And Michael is as responsible as anyone for the revival of this tradition. You have a copy of the words he's about to speak. The proper response, if you agree, is to say, "No." Everybody say that? "No." Ladies and gentlemen, it is such an honor and a privilege for me to introduce you to Michael Nephew.
So the very first part of what I said is, Now you all have a good ear. It will become my duty to gather the words in front of the message he has given us, our Creator, and so that it will be that way in our mind. And on all the rest of it is a repeating pattern of now that our minds are one. And then I would say, give thanks to each of the specific elements. And then I would finish with saying, and now that it's all, let it be that way in our minds. And the different elements I talked about, the first one was the people, all of the people. And then Mother Earth, and then the waters, and then the grasses, and then the medicine plants, and then the fruits, and the strawberry, which is a very special medicine plant. Not the commercial strawberry, there's a natural wild strawberry, and that's the one that we were referring to. And then I talked about the trees and the forest, and specifically, the next one I talked about was the maple, because maple syrup is very big for our people. Then we talked about the animals, and then we talked about the birds. And then we talked about the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. They sustain us. They're very important to the Haudenosaunee people. And we talked about the wind and the thunders. And we talked about our elder brother, the sun, and our grandmother, the moon. And we talked about the stars. And we talked about Handsome Lake, who was one of our spiritual leaders. And then we talked about the Creator. And then I talked that I'm now capable of bringing these words together to you in this opening address. And this is as far as I've learned so far. And so let it be that way in our minds. Then I finished with Daniho, means that is all. And a lot of times when we, especially like a couple months ago at the time of Thanksgiving, us natives are talking, we're like, we kind of find it funny that there's a special day for Thanksgiving because, like has been mentioned in all of that's been brought about today is, we give thanks for everything every day, just like that little kid back there said, everything. That's what it's all about, giving thanks for everything that we have. Her words are so true, Those are the best words of thanks there. It's everything. It's not just one particular thing. It's like everything. And we do that every day, not just one particular day of the year. And, I only have a shorter version of this because our languages were taken from us. My grandfather talked about being beaten for speaking Cherokee in the boarding schools. And my great niece now, she's what we call a first language learner. First language speaker, actually, not learner. She was brought up speaking the language. And I was talking to one of the other people in the language program back home, and he says, she's the first one in 2 generations. And I looked at him and I said, well, in our family, it's 4 generations that we've had a first language speaker. My grandfather, at least 3 of my grandparents were first language speakers, but neither of my parents learned. And my siblings, we didn't learn either, and neither did any of our nieces and nephews as a first language. It's my great niece, my brother's daughter. She's the one that's a first language speaker. And a funny little story is that, some of the other, because my niece we had to take a foreign language, and my niece was allowed to take Seneca as her foreign language requirement. So they've just changed it now to a language requirement. Because it's kind of funny that you had to take Seneca as a foreign language. But anyway, so that was her introduction to being a speaker. And then when she became a young adult, she went to one of the Tom Porter's group in Kandajaharu, which means the clean pot. He's got a language revitalization and a culture revitalization center. And she started learning Mohawk, because all of the languages are similar among the Iroquois, but there's still some differences. Like the Senecas will say Niawe, and the Mohawks will say Niawe Ha. So they're similar, but then some words are different too. Like the Senecas say Ojikate da and Owanawant da for sugar and salt. Well, the Mohawks also say those 2 words for sugar and salt, except they have them the other way. So I'm thinking it has to do with its characteristics. So you got to know who you're talking to, because otherwise you could have some salty coffee. But the irony, so language revitalization is a big thing. I'm really proud of my niece for becoming, as some of the other language instructors are telling me that she's one of the more fluent speakers now. And that my niece is a first language speaker. It's just, it's really proud. But it's, there's an irony in that too, because the native languages were used in both World War I and World War II as codes. They were the only codes that were never broken. But the irony is that at the same time, the children were in the schools, the boarding schools, being beaten for speaking their languages. So, there is that irony. But, we give thanks that as many of the languages that have survived, and that there's work being done to save the languages. I met a guy one time, and by meeting him, I met 20% of the fluent speakers of his language. That meant there were only 5. But he didn't let that stop him. He created books for the children to learn the language. Little kids' books for the language. Even though he knew there were only 5 of them left, and he said we lost 2 in the past 3 years. He didn't let it stop him. He was there trying to revive it as much as he could. And he was thankful that he had that opportunity to. And that made me think about like what we're talking about today. Being thankful for all the things that we've been given for the day. Even if it is a cold day, we're still thankful for the day. We got to see this day. When we went to bed last night, there wasn't a guarantee we'd be here to see this day. And I'm thankful for this opportunity to be here and share these words and share some of our thoughts and some of my thoughts with you. And I'm thankful for what you're all doing for your communities. Tanewa.
And that last part of the words before else, now our minds are one, I think that very beautifully points us to what is sometimes called unity consciousness. And I don't want to paint with too broad a stroke because there are important differences between how various traditions point to unity consciousness, but I also don't want us to miss that there are important similarities as well between this sense of when we offer thanksgiving and having gone through this litany, this sense of oneness with all living things. Western civilization has often started with the atomized individual, these isolated egos, and often indigenous traditions around the world, Eastern traditions, start with this sense of being part of something bigger than yourself. And that can be a really important paradigm shift. So what is, here we see now our minds as one. That's not unlike, there's similarities to what's called Buddha nature, to what's called Christ consciousness, that what's called in the Jewish and Christian tradition, from Leviticus, that book that has a lot of problematic stuff in there, to love your neighbor as yourself. And that as the mystics have always told us, the best way to love your neighbor as yourself is to actually cultivate a lived experience that your neighbor is yourself. We're part of this larger whole. Dr. King said it this way: whatever affects one directly affects me indirectly, because we're part of this mutual garment of destiny, what our UU 7th principle calls the interdependent web of all existence. What Archbishop Desmond Tutu was always talking about, Ubuntu, this African philosophy that I am only because we are. I am only because we are. That's the sense in which we're invited to live boldly and with thanksgiving. So as we prepare to go into the rest of this day and into the week to come, may you continue your journey with love. Care for one another and care for this one earth. Do justice and make peace. And as we go, whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place of hope, of love, or peace or joy, that goes with you out into the rest of your life. We are different for having spent this time together. May you live boldly. May you live with thanksgiving.